On her wedding morning, when the world was filled with music, smiles, and promises of forever, a poor beggar quietly stepped forward and helped the bride when no one else noticed her pain. The guests laughed him off, the groom avoided his eyes, and everyone assumed he was just another stranger looking for attention. But what no one knew was that this beggar carried a secret powerful enough to shake the entire wedding to its core. When he finally spoke, the groom's face turned pale, his breath grew heavy, and the celebration froze in silence. The words that came out of the beggar's mouth didn't just reveal a hidden past, they exposed a truth that the groom had spent years running from. In front of everyone he loved, in the middle of the happiest day of his life, the truth came crashing down, and the groom collapsed. This is not just a wedding story. It's a story about pride, forgotten loyalty, and how one small act of kindness can uncover a past that changes everything. The morning sun rose over the town of Louvre with a soft golden light that made the streets look kinder than they usually were. It was the kind of morning that felt like a promise, as if the world itself had decided to be gentle for once. Music drifted from open windows, women laughed as they carried baskets of flowers, and the narrow road leading to the church filled with people dressed in bright fabrics and hopeful smiles. Today was the wedding day of Zahara and Lovu, a young woman known for her grace and quiet strength, and the town had gathered to witness what many believed was a perfect union. White ribbons fluttered from poles, and the air smelled of fresh bread, incense, and the faint sweetness of flowers laid carefully along the path. Zahara sat inside a small room behind the church, her white dress spread around her like a soft cloud. The fabric felt heavier than she had imagined, not because of its weight, but because of what it represented. Marriage to Kishan Dlamini promised security, comfort, and a future free from the hunger and uncertainty that had followed her since childhood. Yet as women adjusted her veil and praised her beauty, Zahara's thoughts drifted to a different memory, one that returned to her whenever she stood at the edge of something new. She remembered a dusty roadside years ago, a time when she had been younger, poorer, and far more afraid of the world. She remembered a voice that had spoken gently to her when no one else had noticed her tears. The memory felt out of place on a day meant for celebration, but it clung to her like a shadow. Outside, guests gathered, their excitement rising with every passing minute. Kishan stood near the entrance, surrounded by friends who joked loudly to hide his nervousness. He was well dressed, his suit tailored to show confidence, and his smile practiced. To the town, he looked like a man who had won life's favor. Few knew how much pressure he felt to maintain that image. How carefully he guarded the story he told about himself. He laughed when others laughed, but his eyes flicked toward the road now and then, as if he were waiting for something he did not want to arrive. As Zahara stepped out of the room and into the sunlight, a small ripple of admiration passed through the crowd. Her dress caught the light, her veil softened her features, and for a moment, even the noisy street grew quieter. She walked slowly, guided by the rhythm of drums that echoed her heartbeat. With each step, she told herself that this was the right path, that love could grow from stability, that the past did not need to follow her into the future. Yet when she reached the edge of the gathered crowd, her foot brushed against something rough. She looked down and saw a man sitting by the roadside, his clothes worn thin by time, dust clinging to his skin. Most people avoided his gaze, stepping around him as if he were part of the ground itself. The beggar looked up, his eyes unexpectedly clear. There was no desperation in them, only a quiet awareness, as if he saw more than the scene in front of him. Zahara hesitated, unsure why her steps had slowed. The music continued behind her, urging her forward, but something in the stillness of the man's presence pulled at her. He shifted slightly to make room for her dress, careful not to touch the white fabric with his dusty hands. The gesture was small, almost invisible to everyone else, but to Zahara it felt deliberate, respectful, and strangely familiar. As she passed, her veil caught on a loose stone, and the edge of her dress brushed the dust at the roadside. A murmur of concern rippled through the women behind her. Before anyone else could react, the beggar rose slowly and brushed the dust away from the hem of her dress with the back of his hand, careful, gentle, as if handling something precious. His voice was soft when he spoke, barely louder than the drums in the distance. He wished her well, not with the flattery of a stranger hoping for coins, but with a sincerity that felt personal, as if he understood the weight of the moment she was stepping into. Zahara froze. The world around her blurred for a heartbeat. The voice, the tone, the way he held himself despite the rags on his back, it all stirred something deep in her memory. She looked into his face, trying to place him, but time had carved lines where youth once lived. Still, the familiarity was undeniable. Her chest tightened with a feeling she could not name. She wanted to ask him who he was, where he came from, why his presence felt like the return of a forgotten promise. But the music swelled, the crowd urged her forward, and the moment slipped through her fingers. As she moved toward the altar, Zahara glanced back once. The beggar had already lowered himself to the ground again, blending into the dust and noise of the street, as if he had never stood at all. Yet the weight of his words stayed with her, settling into her heart in a way that made her steps feel heavier. Ahead, Kishan waited with his practiced smile, unaware that a single quiet voice at the roadside had begun to unravel a story he had buried for years. As Zahara walked toward the altar, the rhythm of the drums seemed to slow, stretching each second into something heavier than time itself. The smiles of the guests blurred into a single glowing mass of color and sound, yet her mind kept drifting back to the roadside, to the beggar's eyes and a quiet dignity in the way he had brushed the dust from her dress. It was not the action alone that troubled her, but the familiarity of his presence, as though the past had reached out and gently touched her shoulder on the very day she had promised herself she would move forward. She forced her gaze ahead, reminding herself that memories were fragile things, often shaped by longing rather than truth, and that today was about the future she had chosen. Kishan watched her approach, and for a moment his smile faltered. The closer she came, the more his breath tightened in his chest. His friends noticed the shift in his posture, the way his hands trembled slightly before he folded them together, but they mistook it for ordinary wedding nerves. Only Kishan felt the cold knot of fear tightening inside him, a fear that had nothing to do with commitment and everything to do with the fragile story he had built around his life. The beggar's presence at the roadside had not gone unnoticed by him. He had seen the man from a distance, had felt a sudden chill despite the warmth of the morning sun, and the image now refused to leave his mind. As the ceremony began, words of blessing and promise filled the air, but Zahara heard them as if from underwater. She nodded when expected, smiled when prompted, yet her thoughts returned again and again to the man who had spoken to her with such quiet certainty. There had been no plea in his voice, no attempt to draw attention to himself. It was the voice of someone who had known her once, or at least understood her in a way that felt deeply personal. The sensation unsettled her more than she cared to admit. She told herself that the poor often saw weddings as reminders of what they could never have, and that perhaps she had simply projected meaning onto a moment of kindness. Still, her heart did not accept the explanation so easily. When the vows were exchanged, Kishan's voice wavered on the first words. He paused, clearing his throat, forcing his tone into steadiness. The crowd leaned forward, smiling, unaware of the storm rising behind his eyes. Each sentence felt like a weight pressing against his chest, each promise echoing with memories he had tried to bury. The past was not a single moment for him, but a chain of choices, each one shaped by fear, ambition, and the desperate desire to escape the poverty that had once defined him. He had rewritten his story so many times that he had begun to believe his own version of it. Yet the sight of the beggar had cracked that illusion, letting in the air of a truth he had long denied. As the ceremony drew toward its end, murmurs spread through the crowd. Some guests whispered about the beggar who had dared to stand near the bride, others laughed it off as a harmless interruption by a forgotten soul of the town. A few, however, felt an unease they could not explain, as if the calm surface of the day hid a deeper current. Zahara's eyes searched the edge of the gathering, half expecting to see the man again. When she did not find him, the absence felt heavier than his presence had been. It was as though a door had opened inside her, revealing a hallway of questions she was not yet ready to walk down. After the formalities, the couple moved toward the reception area, where food and music waited to turn the ceremony into celebration. Laughter returned, glasses were raised, and the earlier tension faded into polite conversation. Yet Kishan's unease did not leave him. Each time someone clapped him on the shoulder or praised his good fortune, the words felt hollow. His eyes drifted to the road again and again, scanning for the figure he hoped would disappear forever. He told himself that the man was only a beggar, a stranger whose presence meant nothing, yet his heartbeat betrayed the lie. Zahara, meanwhile, felt an inexplicable pull toward the outside air. While guests congratulated her, she smiled politely and excused herself, stepping away from the noise for a moment of quiet. The street was less crowded now, the music muffled by distance. She walked slowly along the roadside, her veil lifting slightly in the breeze. There was no sign of the beggar. In his place, only dust and scattered petals marked where he had sat. A strange sadness settled over her, not because she had lost something tangible, but because she sensed that she had brushed against a truth she did not yet understand. The kindness he had shown her felt like the echo of a promise made long ago, one she could not quite remember but felt in her bones. When Zahara returned to the celebration, Kishan watched her with a tight smile. He wanted to ask her what had happened at the roadside, what the beggar had said, but fear held his tongue. He knew that once words were spoken, they could not be pulled back into silence. The truth he had hidden was fragile, and the smallest crack could cause it to collapse. As the music grew louder and the guests began to dance, he told himself that the moment had passed, that the beggar was gone, and that the past would remain buried where it belonged. But the world has a way of bringing buried things back to the surface, especially when they have been hidden for too long. Somewhere beyond the noise and color of the celebration, the beggar was moving closer again, and with him came a truth that would soon demand to be heard. The celebration grew louder as the sun climbed higher, and with it the illusion that joy could drown out everything hidden beneath the surface. Drums beat with restless energy, children ran between the guests with bright ribbons in their hands, and elders nodded with satisfaction at the sight of a union they believed would bring stability to both families. Zahara moved among them with the careful grace expected of a bride, accepting blessings and kind words, yet her smile carried a weight she could not explain. The memory of the beggar's voice lingered in her mind like a half-remembered song, familiar enough to stir emotion, distant enough to escape clear recognition. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the calm in his gaze and felt again the gentle brush of his hand as he cleaned the dust from her dress, an act that had seemed too intimate for a stranger and too respectful for someone who wished to beg. Kishan tried to lose himself in the performance of happiness. He laughed at jokes he barely heard, raised his glass when others raised theirs, and nodded along to praise about the bright future that awaited him and Zahara. Inside, however, his thoughts circled the same dark center. The beggar's face had stirred memories he had buried beneath years of carefully constructed lies. He remembered hunger, remembered the way poverty had once stripped him of pride, and remembered a boyhood friend who had shared his struggles before their paths split. The thought tightened his chest. He told himself that it was impossible, that time and hardship changed people beyond recognition, that the man by the roadside could not be the same person who had once walked beside him through dust and despair. Still, the fear would not leave him. As the music shifted and the crowd's attention moved toward dancing, a murmur rippled along the edge of the gathering. A few guests turned their heads toward the road, curiosity flickering in their eyes. Zahara followed their gaze and felt her breath catch. The beggar had returned, standing at a cautious distance from the celebration. He did not step forward, did not raise his voice, but simply waited, as though he were standing at the edge of a memory rather than a party. The contrast between his worn clothes and the brightness of the celebration made his presence impossible to ignore. Some guests frowned, uncomfortable with the reminder of hardship on a day meant to celebrate prosperity. Others looked away, pretending not to see him at all. Zahara felt a pull in her chest stronger than before. Without fully understanding why, she stepped toward the edge of the crowd. Her attendants whispered behind her, urging her to stay among the guests, reminding her of appearances and expectations, but Zahara could not shake the sense that something important stood just beyond the circle of music and laughter. When she reached the beggar, their eyes met again, and this time the recognition was sharper, more insistent. The world seemed to narrow around them, the noise of the celebration fading into a distant hum. The beggar inclined his head slightly, a gesture of respect that felt almost formal. He spoke her name softly, not as a stranger would, but with the ease of someone who had known her long before she wore white. The sound of her name on his lips sent a shiver through her. Zahara searched his face, the lines of hardship, the shadow of years that had carved him into someone older than his eyes suggested. Beneath it all, she glimpsed a familiarity she could not deny. The realization stirred fear and curiosity in equal measure. She wanted to ask him how he knew her, but the words caught in her throat. Across the gathering, Kishan noticed Zahara's movement and followed her gaze. When he saw the beggar standing near her, something inside him snapped. The careful walls he had built around his past began to tremble. His breath grew shallow, and a ringing filled his ears. Memories rushed in uninvited, long walks along dusty roads, shared dreams of escaping poverty, promises whispered in the dark about never forgetting where they came from. He remembered the moment he had chosen to leave those promises behind, trading loyalty for opportunity, silence for survival. The beggar's presence was no longer an abstract threat, it was a mirror held up to the man he had become. Guests noticed the change in Kishan's face and exchanged uneasy glances. Some assumed the groom was overwhelmed by emotion, that the weight of commitment had finally settled on his shoulders. Others sensed something more troubling in the way his eyes fixed on the figure at the edge of the crowd. Zahara turned toward Kishan, confusion flickering across her features as she saw the fear he did not bother to hide. The moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken questions. The beggar took a slow step forward, careful not to intrude on the celebration, yet close enough that his presence could no longer be dismissed. His gaze moved from Zahara to Kishan, and in that exchange, years of silence seemed to collapse into a single, charged moment. The air between them felt tight, as if the truth itself were pressing forward, demanding to be acknowledged. Zahara sensed the tension without understanding its source, her heart beating faster with each second of silence. When the beggar finally spoke again, his voice was steady, carrying neither accusation nor plea, only a quiet certainty that unsettled those who heard it. He addressed Kishan by name, using a tone that belonged to shared history rather than polite introduction. A ripple of shock passed through the crowd. Whispers rose, curiosity igniting where comfort had once been. Kishan's knees weakened, the ground beneath him seeming less solid than moments before. The name spoken aloud felt like the final thread holding his carefully crafted life together, and with it tugged loose, the structure of his lies began to sway. Zahara watched the exchange in stunned silence, her mind racing to bridge the gap between the beggar at the roadside and the man her husband seemed to recognize with fear. The celebration around them slowed, the music faltering as attention shifted toward the unfolding confrontation. In that suspended moment, the truth hovered just out of reach, ready to fall and shatter the perfect image of the day. The words that would soon be spoken carried the power to change not only Kishan's life, but Zahara's understanding of the man she had chosen and the past she had never been told. The moment the beggar spoke Kishan's name, the celebration faltered as if someone had pulled the sound out of the air. Conversation stilled, laughter froze in half-smiles, and even the drums seemed to lose their rhythm. A hush spread through the gathering, thick and heavy, carrying the unease of people who sensed they were about to witness something they could not unsee. Zahara stood between the two men, her white dress suddenly feeling less like a symbol of hope and more like a fragile barrier between past and present. She turned her eyes from the beggar to Kishan, searching his face for reassurance, but what she found there unsettled her more than any words could have. His color had drained, his eyes wide with a fear he no longer tried to hide. Kishan opened his mouth as if to speak, but no sound came out at first. His chest rose and fell in quick, shallow breaths, and his hand reached instinctively for the edge of a nearby table, steadying himself against a wave of dizziness. Guests leaned closer, drawn by the tension yet uncertain whether they were allowed to witness such an intimate unraveling. The beggar remained still, his posture calm, as though he had come not to accuse, but to remind. There was no triumph in his gaze, only a quiet sadness, the kind that comes from carrying a truth for too long without a place to set it down. Zahara felt the space between them tighten. Her heart pounded with questions she did not yet know how to ask. Who was this man who knew her husband's name? Why did Kishan look as though he were staring into a reflection of a life he had abandoned? The air seemed to press against her skin, and she suddenly became aware of how exposed she felt, standing in white before a crowd whose smiles had turned into silent expectations. The day that had begun with promise now balanced on the edge of revelation. The beggar spoke again, his voice low but steady, carrying across the sudden quiet. He spoke of shared roads and empty stomachs, of nights spent sleeping under open skies, of promises made between boys who believed they would one day escape the weight of their beginnings together. With each sentence, murmurs rippled through the crowd. People glanced at Kishan in disbelief, struggling to reconcile the well-dressed groom before them with the image of a hungry boy wandering dusty roads. Kishan's grip tightened on the table, his knuckles widening as the past was spoken into the present. Kishan finally found his voice, but it came out strained, as though forced through a narrow opening in his chest. He denied the connection at first, dismissing the beggar's words as coincidence, as the desperate grasp of a stranger seeking attention on a day meant for celebration. The lie sounded thin even to his own ears. The beggar did not argue. He only met Kishan's gaze with a quiet patience that cut deeper than accusation. In that silence, the truth seemed to grow louder, pressing in on Kishan until denial felt like a weight he could no longer carry. Zahara stepped forward, her voice trembling as she asked what this meant, what part of her husband's life had been hidden from her. Her question hung in the air, simple yet powerful, demanding honesty in a moment where pretense had begun to crumble. Kishan turned toward her, and for the first time since the ceremony began, his practiced confidence vanished entirely. The man before her looked small, not because of weakness, but because he was finally facing the parts of himself he had tried to bury. He began to speak, words tumbling out in broken fragments, confessing to a past shaped by poverty, fear, and choices he was ashamed to claim. As he spoke, the crowd shifted uneasily. Some felt sympathy stir where judgment had been ready to take root. Others watched with thinly veiled discomfort, their beliefs about status and worth quietly challenged by the reality unfolding before them. The beggar listened without interruption, his expression unchanged, as though he had not come to shame Kishan, but to witness the truth finally spoken aloud. There was a heaviness in his eyes that suggested forgiveness was possible, but not guaranteed. Kishan's voice wavered as he reached the part of the story he had never intended to share. He spoke of leaving without looking back, of choosing opportunity over loyalty, of building a new identity that did not include the boy he had once been or the friend he had left behind. The confession stripped him of the image he had worked so hard to maintain. His words faltered, his breath catching in his chest as the weight of what he had done pressed down on him. The strain became too much, and his legs weakened beneath him. For a moment, it seemed as though the ground itself had shifted, pulling him toward collapse. Zahara moved instinctively toward him, reaching out as he staggered. The crowd gasped, a collective intake of breath as Kishan's body gave way to the truth he could no longer contain. His voice broke completely, the last words dissolving into silence as his strength failed him. In that moment, the celebration transformed into a scene of stunned stillness, joy replaced by the raw exposure of a man who had run from his past only to have it return on the day he had hoped to seal his future. The beggar stepped forward, not to claim victory, but to steady the moment, his presence a quiet reminder that some truths must be faced before healing can begin. The wedding day, once painted with certainty and promise, now stood marked by a revelation that would change every life gathered there. The final piece of the story waited just beyond this collapse, ready to reveal what such truth would cost and what it might offer in return. The moment Kishan's legs gave way, the celebration dissolved into chaos. A chair scraped against the ground as someone rushed forward, voices overlapping in panic and disbelief. Zahara caught him just before he collapsed fully, her arms trembling under the sudden weight of the man she had believed she knew completely. The world around her blurred into fragments of color and sound, yet her focus narrowed to the shallow rise and fall of his chest. In that instant, the grandness of the wedding, the carefully chosen decorations, and the eyes of the guests faded into irrelevance. What remained was a human being broken by the weight of a truth he had hidden for too long. As others gathered to help, the beggar knelt beside Kishan, his movements slow and deliberate. He placed a steadying hand near Kishan's shoulder, not in accusation, but in quiet support. The gesture surprised those watching. Many had expected anger, perhaps even humiliation, but what they witnessed instead was compassion shaped by years of hardship. The beggar spoke softly, urging those around to give Kishan space to breathe, reminding them that collapse was not the end of a man's story, but often the beginning of honesty. His calm presence brought a strange stillness to the chaos, grounding the moment in something deeper than shock. Zahara felt tears slip down her cheeks as she watched the two men, linked by a history she was only beginning to understand. The revelation had shattered the image she held of her husband, yet beneath the broken pieces, she glimpsed a truth that felt more real than the polished life he had presented to her. She realized that love built on illusion was fragile, and that the foundation of any future they shared would have to be honesty, no matter how painful the first steps might be. Her heart ached with disappointment, but it also stirred with a cautious hope that perhaps truth, once spoken, could open the door to something stronger. When Kishan regained consciousness, his eyes fluttered open to a circle of faces marked by concern, curiosity, and judgment. The weight of what had happened settled over him slowly, each memory returning with clarity he could no longer escape. He met the beggar's gaze, and in that look passed an unspoken exchange of apology and understanding. Words felt inadequate in the face of years of silence, yet the simple act of meeting his old friend's eyes without turning away marked the first honest step he had taken in a long time. The crowd shifted, uncertain how to respond. Some felt embarrassment for having laughed earlier at the beggar's presence, recognizing now the dignity in his quiet endurance. Others felt discomfort as their assumptions about wealth, status, and worth were quietly dismantled before them. The wedding that had begun as a celebration of union now carried a different lesson, one about the cost of denying where we come from and the courage it takes to face it. Conversations hushed, and a reflective silence settled over the gathering, as if each person were privately measuring their own truths against what they had just witnessed. Zahara stood, her posture steadier than she felt. She spoke with a clarity that surprised even herself, acknowledging the pain of learning about Kishan's past in this way, but also recognizing the courage it took for him to finally speak it aloud. Her voice carried neither condemnation nor blind forgiveness, but a measured honesty that set boundaries while leaving room for growth. She told him that the future they had planned could only exist if it was built on truth rather than fear. The simplicity of her words cut through the tension, offering a path forward that did not deny the past but refused to be ruled by it. The beggar rose slowly, preparing to step back into the anonymity he had known for so long. Before he turned away, Zahara thanked him for the kindness he had shown her on the roadside and for the truth he had brought into the light. In her gratitude, he saw the reflection of a kindness he had once known in the girl she had been before life reshaped them both. He nodded, accepting her thanks without seeking reward, his presence a reminder that dignity does not depend on comfort, and that the quiet actions of compassion can change lives in ways no grand gesture ever could. As the beggar walked away, the crowd parted, their eyes following him with a respect that had not been there before. The wedding would continue in some form, but it would never be the same. The day had transformed from a polished performance into a moment of truth, reminding everyone present that the stories we hide do not disappear, they wait for the courage to be acknowledged. Kishan, supported by Zahara, took his first uncertain steps toward a future that demanded honesty. The road ahead would not be easy, but it would be real, and in that reality lay the possibility of redemption. The celebration resumed quietly, reshaped by the lesson it had revealed. Laughter returned in softer tones, and the music found its rhythm again, but beneath the surface, something deeper had changed. The memory of the beggar's kindness and the truth he carried would linger in every heart, a reminder that humility can open doors pride keeps locked, and that the courage to face who we were is often the first step toward becoming who we are meant to be.